They never left the ground, and yet these three men changed spaceflight forever. It is January 27, 1967, Launch Complex 34 at Cape Kennedy Air Force Station, Florida. There is no countdown to orbit today, no fuel in the rocket, no cryogenics loaded. The pyrotechnics are disabled. Engineers have signed off on this exercise with a single, reassuring word: non-hazardous. It is only a rehearsal, a plugs-out test to see whether the spacecraft can run on its own internal power, sealed off from the pad. In 3.5 weeks, on February 21st, this same capsule is meant to carry the first crew of the Apollo program into low Earth orbit. The mission on the books is AS-204. History will rename it in honor of the men strapped inside. History will call it Apollo 1. Inside the command module sit three of the most accomplished aviators America has ever produced. In the command pilot's couch, Gus Grissom, 40 years old, born in April 1926. He is not a rookie to anything. He flew in Mercury. He flew in Gemini. He was the second American ever to travel into space. If any man in that cabin understands the machine and its dangers, it is Grissom. Beside him, Ed White, 36 years old, born in November 1930. Less than 2 years earlier, White had done something no American had ever done. He stepped outside his Gemini 4 capsule and floated free in the vacuum. The first American to walk in space. A national symbol of what the decade could achieve. And in the third couch, Roger Chaffee, 31 years old, born in February 1935. Unlike the two veterans beside him, Chaffee had never flown in space, at all. Apollo 1 was to be his first flight. He had waited his whole career for this seat. 3 men, 2 spaceflight legends, and one about to become one. And all of them are about to die on the ground, in a test everyone signed off as safe. To understand how, you have to understand the air they were breathing. The cabin was pressurized with pure oxygen, not the ordinary mix we breathe, pure oxygen at 16.7 pounds per square inch. That is roughly 2 psi above sea level pressure, deliberately higher than the outside air so engineers could check the sealed capsule for leaks. On paper, it was standard procedure. In reality, they had built a chamber in which almost anything can burn, and burn ferociously. In pure pressurized oxygen, materials that would merely smolder in normal air ignite like paper and race like a fuse. And that cabin was full of things that could catch: nylon netting, Velcro, polyurethane foam, excessive flammable material packed into a sealed can of pressurized oxygen. Running through it all were the spacecraft's electrical veins, silver-plated copper wiring, and later investigation would find that this wiring was not up to standard. The review board would identify deficiencies across the board in the design of the wiring, its manufacture, its installation, the rework done on it, and the quality control that was supposed to catch every one of those failures. Somewhere in the lower left section of the cabin, near the floor, close to a piece of equipment called the Environmental Control Unit, a wire had been chafed, abraded until the Teflon insulation was stripped away. Bare metal exposed. And right there, close by, ran a coolant line carrying an ethylene glycol and water mixture, a line known to be prone to leaks, a spark, a fuel, an atmosphere of pure oxygen, every ingredient of a catastrophe assembled by accident and sealed shut by design. Hold that thought, because the seal is the part that turns an accident into a tragedy. At about 6:31 in the evening, a voice broke across the line. Analysis suggests it was Grissom, a single word. "Hey!" What followed happened faster than any human being trapped inside could survive. Near the Environmental Control Unit by the center couch, the fire found its birthplace, and it did not spread. It exploded outward through the oxygen-soaked cabin. The first, most violent stage of the fire, the rapid rise in pressure and temperature, was over in roughly 15 seconds. 15 seconds. Less time than it has taken to describe it. The suits the men wore were meant to protect them. The oxygen tubes were meant to keep them alive. In the inferno, those very systems melted. And with the protective barriers gone, the crew breathed the products of the fire. The cause of death for all three was cardiac arrest brought on by high concentrations of carbon monoxide, asphyxiation, once the suits and oxygen lines had failed. But here is the detail that turned this from a fatal accident into a national wound. The men might have had a chance if they could have gotten out. They could not. The hatch was the trap. Apollo's command module had a three-piece inward opening inner hatch. Read that again. Inward opening. To escape, the crew had to pull the hatch inward into the cabin. Under ideal, calm, unhurried conditions, opening that hatch took around 90 seconds. 90 seconds on a good day. But this was not a good day. As the fire raged, the pressure inside the sealed cabin spiked, and a hatch that opens inward cannot be opened against a wall of internal pressure pushing it shut. The very forces of the fire slammed the only door and held it closed. Opening it became impossible, and there was nothing to fight the fire with. No firefighting equipment, no compartmentalization to slow the flames, no suppression system of any kind. The spacecraft had been built with no provision for the one thing that was now killing its crew. 3 men sealed inside a pressurized oxygen chamber behind a door that physics had welded shut with no way to put out the flames. The test that everyone called non-hazardous had just killed the first crew of the Apollo program before it ever left the pad. Now, the question that would haunt NASA. Could anyone have known? The answer is the hardest part of this story. Someone did. His name was Thomas Barron, Tom Barron. He was a quality control and safety inspector for North American Aviation, the contractor building the spacecraft. He had started at Cape Kennedy in September 1965, more than a year before the fire. And what he saw alarmed him enough to write it down. A 55-page report documenting shoddy workmanship, uncertified materials, and substandard wiring. He was describing in advance the exact category of failure that would later be blamed for the deaths. And NASA's response. His complaints were reviewed and dismissed, written off as hunches, a word that would echo very differently after January 27th. Because after the fire, Barron did not stop. His report grew. It expanded to roughly 275 pages, and on February 7, 1967, just 11 days after the 3 men died, it was presented to the review board investigating the disaster. That board was formal, and it was serious. 7 members. The Apollo 204 Review Board, chaired by Dr. Floyd L. Thompson, the director of NASA's Langley Research Center. They took the wreckage apart. They traced the wiring. They reconstructed the timeline. And by April 1967, they submitted their final report. The probable cause, a faulty electrical arc, igniting combustibles in that pure oxygen atmosphere, a spark, a fuel, and an air that turned an ordinary fault into a fatal one. Everything the warnings had gestured toward. NASA now stood at a crossroads. The nation had committed to landing on the moon before the decade was out. And it had just lost 3 astronauts on the ground in a spacecraft riddled with the very flaws an inspector had flagged and been ignored on. The agency had 2 choices: bury the failure or rebuild everything. It chose to rebuild. Start with the door that had trapped them. The 3-piece, inward opening hatch was gone. In its place, a single unified outward opening hatch, one that could be opened in seconds, not the 90 seconds the old design demanded under perfect conditions. If fire ever came again, the door would open the right way, and fast. Then the fuel. The flammable materials that had fed the inferno, the nylon, the foam, were replaced with non-flammable alternatives, beta cloth, woven from silica fiber, and Teflon, materials chosen precisely because they would not burn the way the old cabin had. And beyond the hardware, the culture itself was overhauled. Major design and engineering modifications? Yes, but also revised test planning, tightened discipline, new manufacturing procedures, and the quality control that had failed so badly the first time. The very deficiencies the board had named, design, manufacture, installation, rework, inspection, became the targets of reform. 2 years later, human beings walked on the moon, and they did it inside spacecraft shaped by everything learned on the floor of Launch Complex 34. So consider what that means. Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee never reached orbit. Their mission never launched. And yet the redesigned hatch, the fireproof cabin, the discipline that carried later crews safely to the lunar surface and home again, all of it was purchased on the pad in a test that was supposed to be non-hazardous. The warnings were written down. They were dismissed as hunches. 3 men paid for that word. Here is the question worth sitting with. How many hunches are being dismissed right now? And what will it take before someone finally listens?